Hello, everyone. We are continuing our ecology series, I guess, with a conversation about relationships, organismal relationships that they have. So here we go. Oh, sorry, your homework today. It is kind of just a check-in worksheet. There's some questions about the stuff that we're going to go over today, and there's some questions about Earth systems that we talked about yesterday. So that's your homework for tonight. Okay, so survival of most species, this center thing, the survival of most species is going to depend on whatever relationships they have with other species in their environment. So that could be other species that they eat. It could be species that they come into contact with and need to compete against. Or it could be like a beneficial relationship that they're going to have with another species. So obviously, no organism lives inside a vacuum. It's going to interact with different organisms that are not of its same species all the time, and those are going to be really important relationships. So that's kind of what we're focusing on in this lecture. Okay, so what does an organism require the most? So obviously, an organism is going to require food and water, so it needs to be able to sustain itself to be able to survive. Also, it's going to require a mate, especially this is important. We had our discussion about evolution in our last unit and how genes are passed on. If an organism is going to be a member of like the species as a whole and pass on its genes, it's going to require that it mates or that it supports another organism of its species that it itself mates. So for example, that would be like ants. Most ants do not pass on their own genes, but they all support the queen, and the queen is related to them, and so the queen is going to pass on her genes. So there's a couple different ways that can happen, but obviously organisms are going to require shelter. This is going to be able to allow them to escape from predators if they're a prey species. It's going to be a space to sleep, obviously, and to hibernate if that's something that they do. And they're going to require territory. So a territory could be super large. If you're a larger species like a bear or a wolf, you're going to have a very large territory. If you're a smaller species like a squirrel, your territory might just be like one particular oak tree. But a territory is going to allow you to have a monopoly on whatever other resources are within that territory. You're going to be able to defend those as your own and not have to compete against other organisms. So what's really important here is that these 4 resources that organisms most require are the same ones that they're going to compete with other organisms for. They're going to compete for food and water. They're going to compete for mates. You've probably seen videos of like rams that are butting heads in order to get the best female. They're going to compete for shelter, and they're really going to compete for territory. We talked a little bit about like territoriality and mating behaviors in our animal behavior section of our last unit. So some of this should be familiar to you. So our first relationship is one that you already know. It's just competition. This is going to be 2 or more organisms that are requiring the same resource, and they're going to be fighting for it or competing for it. This can happen within a single species. So these 2 male kangaroos are fighting for a mate down here. Or it can happen with 2 different species. So down here on the right, we see that lions have made a kill, and we've got these hyenas that are coming in to try and take that food. So they're competing for food in this one. Our next example of a relationship is another one that you're really familiar with. It's just predator-prey. So this is obviously a fight for survival because the predator needs to survive by eating the prey, and the prey needs to survive obviously by not being eaten. What's cool about this is this really drives a lot of evolution, this predator-prey relationship, because often what will happen is that like a prey species, there will be a random mutation that causes one individual of a prey species to be able to get away a little bit easier. So down here in this example, that could be like the white fur coat of the rabbit allows it to blend in a little bit more. And then there will be a random mutation in the predator species where like maybe one lynx was born with better eyesight. And so that lynx was able to see the snowshoe hare a little bit easier. And so that lynx is going to catch more snowshoe hares and pass on its genes to the next generation. So this relationship really drives a lot of evolution because it's like such a key natural selection relationship. This over here, I liked this image. This is a stick bug that's eating a caterpillar. Okay, so now we're getting into our third type of relationship is a symbiotic relationship. I'm sure you've heard of this before. There's 3 different types of symbiotic relationships. So we've got symbiotic relationships as a whole, and then we're going to talk about 3 different types. But symbiosis as a whole is just a permanent relationship between organisms of 2 different species. So this is not like 2 geese who decide to mate for life or anything like that because they're part of the same species. These are 2 different species of organisms that permanently are associated with each other. At least one organism in this relationship is going to benefit. Both don't have to benefit. There can be a symbiotic relationship where one of them really doesn't benefit, but at least one of them is going to benefit in order for that relationship to continue. So our first example of this is mutualism. If you'd seen Finding Nemo, I just thought about the first part of that. It's really sad, isn't it? Sorry. But if you've seen Finding Nemo, you know that there's this relationship between clownfish and sea anemones. Both organisms are going to benefit in this relationship. So the clownfish is going to be able to stay like kind of hidden from predators, and the sea anemone is going to be kind of defended as a territory. So this is a beneficial relationship for both of them. That's a mutualistic relationship. Some other examples of this are sharks and remora fish. So what happens here is that the remora is going to stay kind of near the shark, and it's going to eat any food scraps that the shark kind of leaves behind. And it's also going to eat parasites that are near the shark's mouth. So this is beneficial to the remora, obviously, because it gets food, and the shark is going to get parasites taken away from it. Another example down here are these ants living in an acacia tree. So the acacia provides shelter and territory for the ants, and the ants are going to defend the acacia from any other organisms that might want to eat it. And our third example over here is these oxpeckers, so these birds that you can see, and this hippo. This is an interesting one. So the oxpeckers are going to eat parasites and bugs off of the hippo. So it's beneficial for them because they're getting food, and the hippo is getting parasites taken off of it. So this is a mutualistic relationship, but there's been recent discoveries that have found that the oxpeckers also like kind of drink these animals' blood. So they'll like cut holes in the hippo and like kind of drink some of its blood. So it's not a purely mutualistic relationship because the hippo is also getting like its blood drink. So that's not good. Our next example is commensalism. So commensalism is where one organism is going to benefit and the other one, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't harm it, it doesn't help it, it doesn't matter. So you might have seen these at the beach sometime, kind of near low tide. These are barnacles. Barnacles are often going to affix themselves to rocks, but they can also go and find shelter or territory on top of other organisms. So like this sea turtle shell, sometimes barnacles will be on whales. And this is a commensalistic relationship because the barnacle is getting a ride first off. So barnacles require moving water in order to eat because that's what brings the food, like the little microorganisms, into their mouth space. And so if they're on top of a moving organism, they are getting like moving water past them all the time. So they're getting food that way. And the organism that they're on top of isn't affected at all. So the sea turtle doesn't care that the barnacles are on top of it. They're not doing anything good. They're not doing anything bad. Another good example of this is epiphytic plants. So an epiphyte is a plant that is going to grow on top of another plant. Usually they're going to grow on trees, like on the bark. So up here on the left, we've got bromeliads, and down here we've got Spanish moss. If you've ever traveled to like South Carolina or Georgia, you might have seen Spanish moss on the trees there. This is going to be beneficial for the epiphytes because they're going to be up away from the ground where there's more predators, so they're going to get a better living space, and it doesn't affect the tree at all to have these on it. And our last type of relationship is parasitism. So this is one that you're probably more familiar with. This is where one organism is going to benefit, but the other one is actively harmed by the relationship. So this is a lamprey up here. I think I referenced lampreys in one of our other lectures. They're pretty weird. They've got circular teeth, so they like don't have a full jaw. They don't have a jaw at all, actually. And lampreys are going to attach themselves to fish. They kind of like scissor their way in there, and they're going to like suck the blood out of the fish. So this is harmful for the fish, you can imagine, but it's beneficial for the lamprey. And we've got obviously a lot of examples of parasitism. Ticks are a parasite. They're going to benefit from taking your blood, but you're going to be harmed from that relationship. This is a really cool one down on the left. This is a tarantula hawk wasp. So that you can kind of see the tarantula obviously on the bottom, and then the hawk wasp is up on the top. This is a super cool relationship. Basically what happens is the hawk wasp is going to look for a tarantula, and it lands on top of it, stings it, and its sting immobilizes the tarantula so that it can't move. And then the hawk wasp lays its eggs on top of the tarantula and then leaves. And the tarantula is fine and like starts moving again. And then eventually the eggs are going to hatch and they eat the tarantula. And it's crazy. You should look up a video because this is also the tarantula hawk wasp. I saw some of them in Costa Rica. They were pretty large. They're not dangerous to anything but tarantulas, but if you do happen to get stung by one, their sting is like apparently the worst thing in the entire world. So you should look those up. They're pretty sweet. I couldn't bring myself to put an actual picture of tapeworms because that's just too disgusting. But tapeworms, obviously, they can live inside stomachs, like human stomachs sometimes, and they'll take food from the organism that they're living inside. So it's beneficial to them, and it's not good because the organism that they're taking food from is not getting as much food. So that's not beneficial to that organism. And then this up here is my favorite one. This is called the lancet liver fluke. This thing is so cool. It has, in its life cycle, it cycles through 3 different organisms in its life cycle. So it starts in a cow or a sheep, like any sort of grazing animal. And then it's going to lay its eggs there, and then the eggs are going to be pooped out of that animal. Oh, whoops, I got too excited. The eggs are going to be pooped out of that animal onto the grass. And then snails, which are going to be kind of in and around the grass, are going to eat the eggs accidentally. And then the eggs are going to be released as like little larvae from the snail and in the slime. And then ants come along because ants live in close proximity to snails. And ants are going to be infected by these little like parasite things that are going to, this is the cool part, the parasites are going to enter into the ant's brain, and the ant is going to have its behavior actually modified by these liver flukes. So the ant, what it does is every night it crawls to the top of a blade of grass because the lancet liver fluke is making it do that. So its brain has become infected. So it's going to crawl on top of a piece of grass and just stay there for the entire night. It hooks its teeth onto the piece of grass and it just stays there. And it's not going to do that during the day because it could burn and it could die. So when the sun starts to rise, the ant climbs back down and goes about its daily life. But every night, it's going to climb up to the top of a blade of grass and just stay there. And then eventually, it is going to get eaten by some sort of a grazing animal, which is where the lancet liver fluke needs to lay its eggs, inside of a grazing animal. So like a sheep or a cow is going to come along and eat the grass, and it's going to eat the ant that's sticking on top of the blade of grass. And then the liver fluke is going to be able to complete its life cycle by living inside of, laying its eggs inside of the sheep or the cow that ate it. It's crazy, and it's the most amazing thing in the entire world that it literally requires 3 different organisms in order to complete its life cycle. But it's a parasite because it's not particularly good for the ant, because the ant does behavior that makes it die. It's crazy. Okay, last one. So, checking question. Which interaction is going to represent a mutualism? So we should think of mutualism as mutually beneficial. So it's going to benefit both organisms. So we've got our 4 interactions over here, and we've got our 2 different organisms here. Interaction A, where it harms both organisms, that's not one of our symbiotic relationships at all. So we can just cross that one off. Interaction B, where one organism benefits and one harms, that's going to be parasitism. Interaction C, where both benefit, that's going to be mutualism. So the answer to this one is C. And then just to check in, D, where there's no effect on one organism and a benefit on the other, that's going to be commensalism. So that's like our barnacles living on top of the sea turtle shell. Okay, that's all I've got. Talk to you later.